Good morning, everybody. Glad to have everybody here bright and early on a Saturday morning. I'm going to go ahead and call to order our retreat for Saturday, January the 25th. We don't have quite as many people in the peanut gallery today, but thank you for those of you that are here. We appreciate having you. And I think, do you want to say anything from yesterday or anything like that?
I think yesterday went very well. Thank you, board members, for participating in our exercise. I think it's going to be very valuable for us as we continue to move forward with the budget process. This morning, we're going to start off with Brent and Chris, and David's back here as well. So presenting you with what's the outlook for projected revenues, what are we doing in collection-wise now, all the way up through what are we looking at for next year. So those guys will get started, and then we'll go in and look at our finances, and Ann Wilson will be talking to us about finances, and then ultimately before lunch we'll do some 5-year plans. Again, these are just examples of what you could look at doing, and give you some different options. Should you choose to go with different options, what's it going to look like at the bottom line? And so that as we move forward and you guys are making the decisions on what you want to add, what you don't want to add, then you'll know what it looks like. So, and then we'll do the survey at lunch, or survey right before lunch. We talked a little bit about the community survey last night, so we'll talk about that, get your input on that, then we'll have some lunch. And then we'll break, and then after that we'll start talking with the schools again. So we're ready to go when you guys are. So.
And again, it's informal since it's a retreat, so if you need to get up and get more coffee or some breakfast, if you didn't get breakfast yet, please, don't worry. You'll be able to hear if you're up and moving around the room. I think you guys will talk loud enough that everybody can hear you, so that won't be a problem. And we're ready to go. Brent, do you want to start? Do you want to
I'm ready to go.
Turn it over to you. Okay.
All right.
Nice to have you all excited.
Okay. On Saturday morning, yeah.
I hear you.
Well, I don't have a whole lot of stats and stuff to show you today, so I want to take a little bit of time, if you'll bear with me, to talk about revaluation in general and our philosophy on revaluation in Cabarrus County. We're exactly halfway in the revaluation cycle, getting ready to start up our 2016 appraisal, and we'll talk about what that looks like a little bit later in the talk. You can't really talk about revaluation over the last couple of years without talking a little bit about what happened in Mecklenburg County and how does that impact us, and how do we avoid having some of the same kind of situations that they had. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about that. I was on a committee, or have been on a committee for the last couple of years. Obviously, when Mecklenburg County started having their problems, the state legislature got involved, and they started talking about wholesale changes to revaluation processes. And of course, we got concerned because our revaluations tend to go pretty well and have gone pretty well, and pretty much are non-issue as far as we're concerned. So we wanted to get involved to make sure that the state didn't go down the wrong path, or what we thought was the wrong path. So we've had a lot of meetings, and a fairly big group gets together and talks about these issues, and I think we've done a good job of heading off any major changes to the revaluation process. And I think as we go forward, the revaluation process will become a little bit more standardized around the model that we use here in Cabarrus County. And so we hope to continue to impact that. Now, the major complaints that I pick up in reading newspaper articles and talking to folks about Mecklenburg is that I see 4 major complaints. Land value was inconsistent, values were not explainable to the taxpayer, and buildings had not been visited in a long time. And fourthly, the appeals were not responded to properly, or the taxpayers felt like they weren't responded to properly. So we'll talk a little bit about how we deal with those issues and how we avoid those type of complaints. Number one, there's 2 types of revaluation tools that counties use in North Carolina. And one of them is what I would call the old school method. It's the referred to in the industry as the grading system. And the new school method, which we use here, we refer to as the point-based system. And the new method is not so new anymore. It started in North Carolina back in the 60s and actually in Mecklenburg County. And then that system kind of evolved through the years, and we're actually using the evolved version of that system here in Cabarrus County. And it's the only system that I've ever worked with in my 37 years in the business. And it's the system that was written to work with computers, whereas the grading system was kind of a manual system. And it's now in computerized systems, but it was written to be a manual system, and they've simply converted it into a computerized system. And I'll tell you a little bit about the difference between those two systems. Unfortunately, there's about 80 counties in North Carolina that still use the grading system, and only about 20 of us that are using the points-based system. And it's just because I guess people have always done it that way, and they're used to using that particular system. The grading system requires highly experienced appraisers to look at each individual property and make a judgment on the value of that property. And what they do is they have very minimal information about the buildings on the system. They'll say it's a frame house with 1,500 square feet and it's got a half upper story. And in many cases, they don't even measure the upper story. They will simply say it's a half upper story, it's a third upper story. And it's very subjective in that it has grades that they apply, and they start with a grade E. They have a quadruple A, a triple A, a double A, an A, a B, C, D, E, and then they have pluses and minuses from those grades. So they have hundreds of different grades they can put on these houses. So you can see somebody would have to really be adept at deciding exactly what grade to use to make that house value correct and to make it consistent with other properties. In my opinion, it's impossible to make it consistent with other properties because you get up one day, you feel different than you did yesterday, and you're more positive or you're more negative, and it impacts your way you make these judgments. So the points-based system, again, was written to use computers. And what we do is we go out, and there's a copy of our property record card on the system. It's kind of small and you can't see it. But we get all this information about the house. We find out what the foundation is, what the subfloor is, what the floor covering is, what the roof structure is, what the roof covering is, what the interior walls are made of. And we go through and we list the components of the house. And the components of the house have percentages associated with them. In other words, a percentage of what the total value of the house is made of. And so with this system, you can go out, you can send a fairly inexperienced lister out to list these components, to measure the house, as long as they understand how to recognize components, as long as they understand how to measure a house. And I don't want to devalue that. That takes quite a bit of training and understanding of exactly how to do that. But as long as you can do that, Megan used to do it for us a while back. As long as you can do that, then you can get an accurate description of the house, and then the computer can take those numbers and it can start to generate information that will be useful to the appraisers in making the final appraisal of the house. So instead of having all these pluses and minuses that we use for adjusting the value of a house, we have points associated with what the house is actually made of. So once that information is collected and put into the system, then we can have well-trained appraisers who actually go and do the revaluation work, looking at each neighborhood, looking at the sales in the neighborhood, and making adjustments to come to a value, and it becomes a fairly easy process to do a revaluation using this methodology. And so when we're done, the taxpayer can come in. If they're really curious, they can print this property card out, and they can actually look at it, and if they look at it long enough, they can figure out exactly what we did to come up with their value. And if they can't figure it out, they can obviously come in and speak to one of our appraisers, and we can explain it to them. Now, the cardinal rule, when I first started in the business many years ago, the cardinal rule was in revaluation work is you must be able to explain to the taxpayer who's sitting across the table from you exactly how you came and arrived at the value that you put on their property. And I think that was one problem that they had in Mecklenburg, was they were a little bit confused about which system were they using? They were using kind of a hybrid, partially grading, partially points-based. Then they brought in a regression analysis into the picture. So when they were done, they had a product that was very difficult to explain to the taxpayer. And so I think that was part of the problems they had. So what we do is, of course, use our system. We go out and one thing I meant to tell you was that the grading system is a building-based system. They put most of the emphasis on what they're going to put on the building, and their land appraisal is very, very general. On our points-based system, we put heavy emphasis on land value. We spend about 6 months developing our schedule of values. We study the sales throughout the county, and we focus heavily on land value because land value is very subjective, and everybody has an opinion on land value. So we build all these models that we use on land value, and we build this huge schedule that we use to apply to land to make sure that we're both reaching market value and we're consistent and equitable, and we can explain it to the taxpayer how we came up with these values. Because we use the point system, we don't have to spend near as much effort on appraising buildings. And so that gives us a better product. Now, one of the other issues was that buildings had not been visited in a long time. And we pretty much were in the same boat here several years ago. Probably 20 years ago, the legislature passed a law that prior to that, you had to, every time you did a revaluation, you had to go out and visit all the properties. But it got incredibly expensive to do that. So the legislature passed a law that said you don't have to look at the properties, you just have to analyze the sales and analyze the neighborhoods, come up with a value, and then if you determine you need to go look at them, then you go look at them. And at the same time, it told the taxpayers that if you want us to look at them at your house, then we have to come. All you have to do is request it, and we have to come out and look at it. And of course, we are more than willing to do that. So the way we overcame this issue of not visiting houses is during the last revaluation. We started this in late 2010. We decided to do a pictometry review, which pictometry is our oblique imagery, which if you're not familiar with what that is, it's aerial photography that's flown at a lower altitude, and the camera takes photographs at angles so that we're seeing the property at angles, and we can actually spin the property around and look at it all four sides of the property. So we started this project, and this is what the workflow looked like on that project. We had our software vendor write a system that our appraisers could go to a neighborhood, and they could start with the first parcel, and it would pull up the property record card and the photograph of the house automatically. And they could sit there and they could look at the two and make sure they were in sync, that they looked correct. And they could spin this house around, look at all four sides. Excuse me. And they could either complete that property, or they could mark it as pending, or they could mark it that it needed a field visit. And so we sat down, we had 8 appraisers, spent 7 months, went through all 84,000 parcels in the county like this, and one at a time. They hit the button, it brings up the next one, and they just sit there all day. We gave them a break now and then, but they sit there all day looking at these houses. They wound up with getting through it. So we're feeling pretty good about our data, but there are obviously some properties that we need to field visit. And so flip to the next slide, please. Just to give you an idea of what this imagery looks like, this is one house, and it's from 4 different angles. So you can see, you can get a pretty good look at the house from this angle. You can't see in the witness, and so we weren't peeking on anybody. But you can actually zoom this in, zoom it out. You can actually, there are measuring tools. We can actually take sample measurements to make sure that if something looks odd, we can measure it to see if it really is odd or it's not odd. We can obviously see if we're missing paving or if we're missing outbuildings. We can see if we're missing decks and porches. We can actually zoom in close enough to see air conditioners. So if on older homes, if we didn't have them as air conditioned, we could tell whether the air conditioners were there or not. And flip to the next slide, please. this is kind of a summary of what we found out in doing that review. And again, we started in 2010, leading up to the 2012 revaluation, and we did approximately 11,000 parcels in 2010. Of those parcels, 212 of them needed a field visit or needed a change made to them. So that's not a very high percentage. We increased our value on those 212 parcels by $2.3 million. Average change of almost $11,000 per property changed. And those numbers are accurate numbers based on the data that we were actually using at the time. Now, if you go to 2011, I have to get a little creative with those numbers because by that time we were working in the revaluation file. So we were making revaluation changes at the same time we were making pictometry review changes. So the value change kind of got intermingled there. So I just for illustrative purposes, and I can't swear that this number is exactly accurate, I just took the 10,000, roughly 11,000 per change, and I extrapolated over to the 71,000 parcels that we reviewed in 2011 and estimated that we probably made about a $47 million increase in value due to that review. And so that was the review leading up to 2012, which indicated we made a lot of changes during that time. We found some of our larger issues we cleared up during that time. Now in 2012, we didn't do any review work because we were finishing up the reval and we were doing appeals and all that sort of thing. But obviously we didn't have time to go out and do field reviews on everything we identified that we needed to during that lead up to the revaluation. So we're still continuing to make field checks on these properties to make sure that we got them accurate. And in 2013, we did 3,054 parcels. We picked up $13.6 million worth of value, about $4,482 per parcel that we made changes to. So obviously we got the bigger stuff leading up to the revaluation. Now we're picking up smaller things that we identified. And so we have about 5,400 parcels still left to visit, and we're going to try to get that done. Chris and David informed me that they're going to get that done this year. I kind of broke it up into 2 years, but it looks like we hopefully can expect to pick up another $20-some million in value for a total pickup of about $87 million in the value of the county based on this project. And irregardless of how much we picked up, I mean, our preference would be to pick up less money because that would mean our database is better to begin with. But still, on a $15.5 billion real estate tax base, $87 million is not very much money. And so it showed that about roughly 16% of the properties needed some type of an adjustment in the value. And we generated about $600,000 worth of tax revenue per year off of those changes that we picked up. But the good thing for us is that we feel really good about our database now. We feel like it's in good shape, and we don't have the issues that maybe Mecklenburg ran into with erroneous data on the property record card. So, next slide, please. So the question is, where do we stand now with the revaluation, with our values, and how are values changing? In the county, the State Department of Revenue does a quarterly sales ratio study on our database, and they do that for all 100 counties every quarter. And the way they do that is they send us a random sampling of deeds, and we have to go select those deeds out, select those random sales out, and provide them to them. And then they do a ratio study on that. And this is the result of that ratio study through. And unfortunately, that's kind of hard for you to see. But I think you have it in your packet, I guess. So this ratio starts the last quarter of 2011, which is the last quarter before our revaluation took effect. And it goes through the second quarter of 2013. And you can see from the graph that our ratios have remained relatively flat according to their studies. We started out at about a 99.28% of market value in the fourth quarter of 2011, It dropped a little bit in the first quarter of 2012. And of course, if our ratios are dropping, that means values are rising, and vice versa. So they dropped a little bit in the first quarter of 12, then they rose back up above 100% in the second quarter of 2012, and they remained at roughly 100% for the next 4 quarters actually, into the first quarter of 2013. And then we saw a drop in the second quarter of 2013 down to 97%, which would indicate maybe that our values are starting to increase a little bit. The standard deviation that the state runs is in the second graph, and our standard deviations running from 9.5% to 12% as we go through these quarters, and these are well within the norms that we would expect for mass appraisal type work.
Is this ratio, it's comparing our value compared to fair market value by sale?
Actual sales price.
Why is the fourth quarter 2011 shows a very good ratio right there, except that was right before we did our revaluation. So wouldn't you have expected our value to be significantly off because we hadn't done the revaluation yet?
No, these are revaluation numbers compared to the fourth quarter. In other words, we use 2011 sales prices to do our revaluation. So these sales prices are matched to our revaluation numbers.
Okay, revaluation numbers.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, we'll flip to the next page. So these samplings that the state uses are relatively small. They run from 70 sales up to 137 sales. So we do our own internal sales ratio study, and we think we get a little bit better numbers, but the numbers actually compare very favorably with what the state's coming up with. So these are our ratio numbers, and the number of sales per quarter range from 300 up to 606 sales. And again, you can see the same pattern here, that we showed 98.68% in the fourth quarter of 11, just before the revaluation. And we intentionally shot a little bit below 100% because we suspected that the sales prices of property were going to continue to decline a little bit going into the following year. And when that happens, if it's too drastic, like it was after the 2008 revaluation, then we get pounded to death with appeals. And from 2008 to 2012, we had numerous appeals constantly because values were continuing to drop well below what our assessments were. So that was a very tough 4 years for our office, just dealing with all the complaints and dealing with all the appeals. And so you can see that our expectations were correct, that in 2012, our ratio rose to slightly above 100%, but very close to 100%, and it stayed that way for the entire year. But then if you look at the fourth quarter of 12, it starts to decline a little bit, and then as we go into, and we're going on this report, we're going all the way through the fourth quarter of 13, and it continues to decline slightly throughout 2013, which would indicate we're getting some slight increase in value, sales price of properties in the county. And again, the second graph shows the coefficient of dispersion. The state uses standard deviation, but the true measure that we use in mass appraisal is the coefficient of dispersion, and the coefficient of dispersion is a statistic that's written specifically for mass appraisal. And the standards for the coefficient of dispersion are established by the International Assessment Association. And so you can see our coefficient of dispersion is remaining under 10% throughout all of that time. You can see it was very low right in the fourth quarter of 12, and of course it's not surprising that it's very low because our appraisers had the opportunity to look at all those sales and make sure everything was exactly right. But the true measure of how good we did with the appraisal is the statistics after the revaluation, when they no longer have the opportunity to play with them. So the standards have held up very well. Our ratio is very, very close to 100%. Our coefficient of dispersion remains below 10%, which is exceptional. And there's two reasons it stays low. And we have we have a lower coefficient of dispersion than most counties in North Carolina, even though some other counties do a very good job with that. Also, the reasons are what I explained to you earlier. Number one, we've cleaned up our data. Our data's good. Number two, we have a good system. The points-based system does a much better job keeping everything equitable and in line. So we're very happy with our stats 2 years out from the revaluation. Obviously, our values are not changing very drastically, and so we had some conversation around the office, do we really need to do a revaluation for 16? So we spent a lot of time over the last few weeks looking at that and looking at what the possibilities are and what effect it may have. And we come to the conclusion that, yeah, it's probably okay for us to go ahead and do one. From an equity standpoint, we do have some neighborhoods that are maybe a little high, some neighborhoods that are a little low, and we can bring those back into line and just address some basic issues that we see in retrospect concerning the last revaluation. So if you'll flip to the next slide. I kind of took that sales ratio study and its relationship to market value, and I kind of projected if that same curve continued into the future for the next 2 years, and of course we don't have any way of knowing whether it will or it won't. Values could increase a lot quicker, or they could go the other direction. We just don't know. But if we just take that, we had about a 2.8% increase, the way I interpret it, from the end of 12 to the end of 13. So if we project that on into the future, we would look at an increase in value of somewhere between 6 and 7% for the revaluation. Now, you can't always tell just from your sales ratio what that's going to do to your revaluation, because most of your sales in your ratio are single-family residential homes. Most of them are fairly new homes. And so we're not getting a lot of sales of vacant land. We're not getting a lot of sales of commercial industrial properties, but we're getting some. And so we took a look at all those different aspects of it, and it seems that everything is kind of appreciating maybe at a similar rate. Whereas in the past, when you have a very strong economy, like we had for our 04 revaluation and our 08 revaluation, you get fairly extreme changes of value, mainly driven by vacant land, because vacant land is much more volatile than buildings. Buildings tend to appreciate in a good economy in North Carolina, they're going to appreciate at 4 or 5% a year pretty consistently. In a bad economy like we had over the last several years, they tend to depreciate at a fairly consistent amount. But land is extreme sometimes. You can have land values that are going up double in a 4-year period, or you can have them dropping in half or more in a 4-year period. Just depends on what the environment is and what the investors are looking to do. And of course, back in 04 and 08, we had our vacant land was driven by people wanting to buy it and develop it. And there's very little of that going on now, so we're having very few sales of large acreage tracts. So all that said, we're just assuming that everything will change at a fairly similar rate, and will be somewhere in the 7 to 8% increase in value due to the revaluation. Next slide. And so that brings us to this year's budget and what we're looking at. And we've given preliminary estimates, and it's very early in the year for us to actually give totally accurate estimates because we haven't finished our work for the year. But we've given some estimates, and that top row shows those estimates, and Ann and Parth will go over that information in more detail a little bit later. And in comparing it to last year's, kind of my estimate of what last year's numbers are ultimately going to shake out to be, showing about roughly a 2% increase in real estate, 1.5% in personal, 2% in public service, and motor vehicles a slight increase. And most of that deal with the motor vehicles is relating to this shift over to the new way of billing motor vehicles. And we've got some two things affecting motor vehicles. Number one, used motor vehicles for the last couple of years have been selling very high because there's been a very limited amount of them available. That has kind of reversed now, and there's a lot of availability of used vehicles. So used vehicles have declined, and so that's going to hurt our value for 1 year, I think. The other thing that's going to hurt our values a little bit is we've shifted in the old system of doing motor vehicles. Each county kind of got to set their own rates that they were using. With the new VTS system, they're having a one valuation system statewide. Whether that's good or bad is up for debate. It's consistent, but vehicles sell differently in different parts of the state, and different types of vehicles sell differently in different parts of the state. And so in Cabarrus, vehicles, we always use the high schedule on vehicles. Our vendor who supplied vehicle values had a low, medium, and high value. We always use the high. The state apparently is using the medium. And so we're seeing about a 7% decline in our actual values that we're assigning to vehicles on the new system. So that's up for debate. That's the Department of Revenue gets to pick the schedule, and we tell them if we think they're too low, we tell them, and it's up to them what they do with that. So the VTS system, the switch over to billing on the registration card, I think is a great thing, and many of us in the assessment community were behind that for many years trying to get that done. And the reason that I think it's a good thing is because of the collection issues involved in it. In the old system, we would send out the bills, and about 60% of the people would pay them on time. And then for the next 12 months, we were trying to get that other 40% paid. And many people just refused to pay them until they renewed their tag. And so now they get to pay them when they renewed their tag. So I think the taxpayers are going to be happy with it. And I think we're going to be happy with it because we were spending so many resources in our collections department trying to collect motor vehicle bills to keep the collection rate up, that we should have really been spending on collecting real estate bills, which are much more lucrative for the county for us to collect. So I think it's going to be a good thing. I think it's gone out fairly smoothly considering what a huge project it was. We were kind of all gritting our teeth thinking that it was going to be really tough. And there have been some issues, but they've been fairly minimal, and I think they've done a good job with it. So I think once we get through this first year, that we're gonna like this new system. I think the taxpayers are gonna like the new system. Now, that doesn't really change anything for our assessment office. We still do the same things with motor vehicles that we've always done. We just do it on a different system. But it does relieve our collectors from having to do the collection efforts on them. So. Now, you might notice in Ann and Parth's discussion that the values that I show here are in some cases slightly different from the values they show, and probably need to hammer that out. But a lot of that has to do with pending appeals, and I tend to kind of deduct those from my numbers, whereas they're more or less reporting numbers that are actually billed, but we're all working all that out, so we don't have to worry about it. Next screen, please. We feel very fortunate that we only have 2 property owners that are still have pending appeals from the last revaluation, as opposed to our 2008 revaluation when we just had constantly a dozen or 2 dozen appeals pending at all times at the Property Tax Commission. So the only 2 we have left are the Charlotte Motor Speedway and Corning. Of course, those are 2 of our biggest property owners, so they could have big impacts on our assessed value depending on how they shake out. Unfortunately, the Charlotte Motor Speedway appeal is still pending from 2008. So we have the 2008 value to have litigated, and then of course we have the 2012 value to litigate. We do have the Speedway appeal scheduled for April of this year before the Property Tax Commission, and we're hoping that they will hear it in April and that we will get the 2008 value resolved. And based on the outcome of that appeal, we should be able to sit down and resolve the 2012 value. based on the same logic that's applied there. Now, we have a value, I'm showing a value of $260 million. That's the 2012 value. The 2008 value, I think, was in excess of $300 million. On both of those appeals, they say the value should be $78 million. So as you can see, we got a huge difference of opinion of value. And so it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. Now, with Corning, this is only a 2012 appeal. We didn't have a problem with them in 2008, or we did, and we settled it. But Corning, we have a value of $147 million. On the plant, they say it's worth $30 million. And we have, on both of these two appeals, we have major philosophical differences on the way that you would value these properties. And we consider them both to be special purpose properties. And in appraising special purpose properties, you use cost minus depreciation to come up with your value, which is what we've done. They, on the other hand, have hired appraisers to go out and appraise their properties at what, if they just put it on the market and sold it, what they could get for it, or what they think they could get for it. And the Speedway is a very difficult property to do that way. Corning's not so hard to do that way, but basically if you're appraising Corning under that scenario, you would just be looking for other industrial buildings around the southeast that have sold. In many cases, they were vacant at the time they sold, and they sold at, pennies on the dollar of value. And so we'll just go argue that at the Property Tax Commission and see what they have to say about it. But we feel good about our position on both of those. We have hired some outside appraisal consultants to help us with those, and it's because we're talking about a lot of money, and we don't want to actually go down there and lose. So we're talking about $300 million that is actually under appeal.
I've got a question about that. With the Corning situation, are they paying their tax bill currently, and then whenever it's pending, are they paying it, and then?
They are not. They have the opportunity, anytime you're under appeal, you can pay all of it and expect a refund if you win, right, or you can pay none of it and pay your bill when it's finished, or you can estimate what you think you'll ultimately have to pay, and you can pay that amount, and that's what they're doing. Right. That is also what the Speedway is currently doing. Now, the Speedway, I believe, has paid all of their bills from 2008 up through last year, I think, and I think maybe the last 2 years they've done an estimate and paid on an estimated amount. So we're very anxious to get these heard and out of the way.
Right. I have a follow-up question to that, and this may be more directed to the county manager. How does that affect their tax incentive package that they received?
The policy is you have to pay first before you receive the benefit of the incentive agreement. So. Okay.
So how will that work out if we go to if it goes to the commission, the property tax commission, and their value really is, we'll say it's what you guys have it assessed, and they haven't been paying tax on that? Will we then in turn, whenever they have to pay the additional?
We would make the same adjustments.
Okay.
On that policy, or on that process, just as Brent would on the taxes.
Okay. And whenever that tax incentive was approved, do you recall what their promised investment was at the time?
Know.
Okay.
I
would like to see that. Yeah.
On Corning, I think there's two pending incentive grants. One is $69 million, and one is $50 million.
Okay.
Hey Brent, is the fact finder on your appeals limited to one of these two options, or do they have complete discretion between whatever they're looking at? In other words, do they have to go with $30 million or $147 million, or they can figure anything that they want?
They can go anywhere in between, anything below, anything above, whatever they want to come up with. So we're actually on the Speedway appeal, our outside consultant came up with a little higher value than ours, so they could go with that value. And we've just started talking with someone about doing something for us on the Corning appeal. So hopefully we can push that one through and get it heard in the fall of this year, maybe. But just to wrap up, appeals in Cabarrus County, we have them, I think, structured in a way that are fairly friendly to the taxpayers. Of course, it's a big, busy time for us all when we send out notices, and taxpayers may not always be happy, but I think we give them the benefit of the doubt and the ability to follow through with their appeals. When we send out the revaluation notice, we actually tell them, the appraiser who's responsible for their area, we give them their phone number. They can actually call the appraiser that works their area and talk with them, so they got somebody on the phone who knows about their appraisal and can talk intelligently with them. And a lot of the people do that, and so we sit in our office after the notices go out and just talk with people on the phone for 4 to 5 weeks, and then hopefully that limits the number of people who appeal. But if they, after that conversation, if they want to appeal, they just fill out the form that's attached with their notice, send it back in, and give us the information they want us to consider. And we go through what we call an informal appeals process. That's not statutory, but it's historically what revaluations have always done in North Carolina. And I think maybe the legislature's getting ready to make that part of the statutes, and that gives the appraiser the opportunity to take a second look at the appraisal, give the property owner a new opinion, and then at that point, the property owner can file an appeal with the Board of Equalization Review and come in and make their case before that board. And then, of course, after that, they can go to the Property Tax Commission. After that, they can go into the court system all the way to the Supreme Court. So taxpayers have their rights protected to file their appeal, and as long as they continue to press it. And what we encourage taxpayers to do after, well, they should do it yearly, but after every reevaluation, or certainly after every change in value, is they should take a look at that property record card and make sure it looks like what they think it should look like, and that things are listed correctly, and start there. And if they find errors, then they need to address them. And if they think they're right and we're wrong, they need to keep pressing their appeal until somebody gives. Any other questions?
Where are we at with the Speedway and Corning? Are they at the very early stages of that? It doesn't sound like they're in front of the court system yet, so they could potentially keep on fighting this for a little while.
They're in front of the Property Tax Commission. Both of them are now. And certainly after we go to the Property Tax Commission and they give a ruling, they can press that on to the Court of Appeals if they wish to. And hopefully they don't. Hopefully we reach a reasonable value that we can all live with.
I have one other question. In our general fund balance, we have $4.4 million assigned to a contingency for appeals. Is that $4.4 million related to the revaluation in 2012, or is that something that you just keep $4.4 million in there every year, no matter if we did a revaluation recently or not?
No, I do an estimate yearly on what is pending out there that we may lose, and most of that 4.4 is relating to the Speedway case going back to 2008, but also a little bit of it would be Corning for 2012. And basically, we've kind of talked it around, and we come up with a percentage that we think we might stand to lose, and we keep that money on hand.
That number has not changed since October, and it sounds like we need to keep that amount allocated for a period of time continuing forward. Is that your opinion?
Yes, I think Pam and I took a look at that a couple of months ago, and the number still is good. And hopefully in April we'll get a decision. We can clean out most of that. Hopefully we'll keep it all and get some more.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else have any questions? You guys all do a good job. It is hard to, I think, for a lot of people to understand all the complexities that you have to deal with when you're looking at property. I'll tell a quick story. They had, during the reval, in my neighborhood, I came out, I know, they're laughing because they don't know exactly what it is. I came out of my neighborhood and got a couple blocks away, and there was this guy walking around a house with a clipboard, and we'd gotten some calls saying, be careful because there might be some scammers out there, walking around, which actually I got a phone call last night about, from the city about the potential of that. So anyway, I come out and I see this car parked there and I pulled over. I'm trying to act like I'm not really a suspicious character myself. And pulled over and I'm looking, I'm trying to figure out what that is, and I tried to call Mike and he didn't answer, and I tried to call Pam and she didn't answer, and finally then Mike calls me back. Anyway, the person got in the car and they drove off, and so I went to follow him and he stopped, and I thought, well, this is great. Now what I'm going to do is really going to look like I'm following him. And there were a couple spots where they could stop. Finally I thought, if this guy's going to get out, it's going to be a real problem for me. And finally, they called me back, and they knew exactly who it was. And yes, it was somebody in their department. The problem was the city seal on the side of the car. I think he had thrown it in the trunk or something, so it had gotten a little bit bent. It didn't look quite perfect. So I thought it looked like somebody had thrown something in the trash and pulled it out, and they were just slapping it on the car, and that it was, in fact, a scam. And so I was like, great, thanks for calling the guy and telling him I'm the one that's stalking him up there. But it was kind of funny. And then I went back and talked to the neighbor and told the neighbor that I had been sitting out there and stalking the appraiser. But anyway, so they all laughed at it. They thought it was funny that I was all worried about my neighborhood. But I do know that you send people out, since I witnessed him walking around the house and everything. So anyway, I'll be careful not to stalk anybody, any of your other department members. So. Let's take a short break if you want to refill your coffee. We're just a few minutes ahead. If you don't have any other questions, or obviously they're still here, you can ask them something, any questions that you might have over the break. And about 9:45, we'll get ready to start up again, and we'll get Ann and Parth up here to start talking about the 5-year plans. Okay? Great.